Before we begin, comment below which city you're watching from. If we're in the same place, I'll reply personally. April 1945. The Red Army was closing its iron ring around Berlin. The sound of artillery was a constant rumble on the horizon like a summer storm that never broke. For the men of the 3rd Shock Army, it was just noise. They'd been fighting from Stalingrad to the Oder River, and the final push felt less like victory and more like a grim cleanup operation. They were exhausted, their uniforms caked in the mud of 1,000 miles. My unit, a small reconnaissance detachment led by Lieutenant Alexei Volkov, was given a simple order: sweep through a wooded area northeast of the city. Intelligence suggested a minor SS administrative outpost might be there. A place to grab documents, maybe a few prisoners, then move on. We expected broken buildings, maybe a few fanatics putting up a last stand. What we found didn't make sense. The facility was there just as the maps showed, but it was silent. Not the silence of abandonment, but the heavy, dead silence of a place that had been sealed shut. The main gate was a slab of reinforced concrete recently poured. There were no bodies, no spent shell casings, no signs of a fight, just this absence. Lieutenant Volkov radioed command. The response was typical for those chaotic days: investigate and secure. So we planted charges. When the dust cleared, we saw a staircase leading down into the earth, into a darkness that seemed to swallow the weak spring light. We had no idea we were about to walk into the Third Reich's most desperate, most forbidden secret. We found a Nazi occult lab. What we saw inside wasn't human. To understand why that lab existed, you have to understand the state of Nazi Germany in those final months. By April 1945, the war was lost. Everyone knew it. The Allies were advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east. Berlin was being pounded into rubble, but within the inner circles of the SS, particularly the Ahnenerbe, Himmler's research division for ancestral heritage, a different kind of desperation was taking hold. This wasn't about conventional weapons anymore. They had gambled on wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket and the Me-262 jet, but it was too little, too late. So they turned to the unthinkable. They began digging into the occult, into ancient myths and forbidden science, searching for anything that could reverse their fate. This wasn't a new interest for the Nazis. Himmler had been obsessed with the occult for years, funding expeditions to Tibet and excavations across Europe looking for relics of a supposed Aryan master race. But in 1945, this fringe obsession became a central, frantic mission. It was a shift from academic curiosity to a last-ditch effort to summon a power that could defy the advancing armies. The logic was twisted but clear. If they couldn't win a war of men and machines, they would try to win a war of spirits and entities. They believed that ancient Germanic legends held truths about supernatural forces. The Thule Society, which had influenced the early Nazi Party, spoke of a lost Hyperborean civilization with access to incredible powers. As the Soviet artillery shells began to fall on Berlin, high-ranking SS officers weren't just preparing for a last stand. Some were desperately trying to complete rituals, to open gateways, to create something that could not be killed by a bullet. This is the crucial context. The lab we found wasn't a place of rational science. It was a temple to this final, insane hope. The scientists and occultists stationed there weren't trying to build a better tank. They were trying to build, or perhaps summon, a new kind of soldier. A soldier that didn't need food or sleep, that felt no fear, that could not be stopped by conventional means. They were playing with forces they barely understood, driven by an ideology that had already consumed millions of lives and was now, in its death throes, reaching into the darkness for salvation. The facility's location was also telling. Tucked away from the main fronts, it was a place meant to be forgotten, a secret buried deep. While Hitler raved in his bunker about armies that no longer existed, these men were conducting experiments that blurred the line between biology and mythology. They were creating a legacy not for a 1,000-year Reich, but for an eternity of something else entirely. And as we descended those stairs, We were walking directly into the heart of that madness. The man behind this descent into the occult was Heinrich Himmler. While Hitler focused on the war, Himmler was building his own empire within the SS, an empire based on a bizarre fusion of pseudoscience and ancient mythology. His personal obsession wasn't just a hobby. It became official state policy through an organization called the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Society. Founded in 1935, its stated goal was to research the archaeological and cultural history of the Aryan race. In reality, it was a clearinghouse for the occult, funding expeditions to find the Holy Grail, the Spear of Destiny, and the lost city of Atlantis. Himmler genuinely believed that by uncovering these ancient relics and mastering forgotten rituals, the SS could tap into supernatural powers. He saw himself as the reincarnation of a medieval German king and modeled the SS after the Teutonic Knights. His headquarters at Wewelsburg Castle was designed as a spiritual center for this new pagan order, complete with a round table for his 12 top generals. This wasn't just eccentricity. It was the foundation of a belief system that justified unimaginable cruelty. If you believe you are a master race destined by occult forces to rule the world, then any atrocity becomes permissible. By 1943, as the war began to turn against Germany, the Ahnenerbe's mission shifted dramatically. It was no longer about academic research. It became about occult warfare. They began experiments in remote facilities, places like the one we found. Their work was a horrifying blend of cutting-edge science and dark ritual. They experimented with psychotropic drugs on concentration camp prisoners, trying to expand human consciousness or create supersoldiers. They researched the world ice theory, a crackpot cosmological idea, believing it held the key to ultimate power. The most desperate projects, the ones initiated in the final year, were the most extreme. They were attempts to create what they called Die Totenkopfwächter, the Death's Head Guardians. These weren't meant to be living soldiers. The concept was based on a perversion of Norse mythology, the idea of the Einherjar, the warriors who die in battle and are brought to Valhalla to fight again at Ragnarök. The Nazi occultists believed they could use a combination of advanced biology and ancient summoning rites to bind a non-human consciousness to a reanimated corporeal form. A soldier that could not be killed because it was already dead, animated by something else entirely. This was the ultimate expression of Himmler's obsession. Faced with the collapse of his worldly empire, he doubled down on building a supernatural one. The lab we entered was a direct result of this final, frantic push. The clean, clinical side of the facility was where the biological work was done, the surgery, the preservation. The other side, the chamber covered in runes, was where the binding was attempted. They weren't just scientists. They were priests performing a blasphemous sacrament for a dying god. They were trying to cheat death itself by offering it a uniform. And as we moved deeper into the complex, the evidence of their work was everywhere, a trail of madness leading to a single, silent room. The official records we found later called it Sonderprojekt Schwarze Sonne, Special Project Black Sun. But in the spring of 1945, our intelligence on it was almost non-existent. It was a ghost, a whisper in the static of intercepted radio traffic that the higher-ups largely dismissed. We were frontline reconnaissance, not spies, but even we had heard the rumors. The talk among the political officers was of a Nazi Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon, but the descriptions didn't match a rocket or a jet. They spoke of something that could break the will of an army, something that operated on a different level entirely. Our first real clue came from a prisoner, an SS administrative clerk captured during the fighting for Kustrin. He was terrified not of us, but of something else. During interrogation, he kept babbling about a cleanup operation his unit was supposed to perform at a research facility near Bernau. He said they were ordered to destroy everything, but when they arrived, the place was already sealed from the inside. His commanding officer, a staunch Nazi, had taken one look at the concrete-blocked entrance, turned pale, and ordered a full retreat. He told his men that the Guardians were already awake and that their duty was to contain, not to engage. The clerk didn't understand the meaning, only the fear. That report was filed away as the ravings of a defeated man, but Lieutenant Volkov remembered it. When our orders came to sweep the same sector, he knew it was the same place. The facility itself was a masterclass in obscurity. From the air, it was a nondescript cluster of low buildings that looked like a small agricultural depot or a forestry station. There were no large antenna arrays, no railway spurs for heavy equipment. It was designed to be overlooked, but on the ground the details were wrong. The perimeter fence was newer and heavier gauge than anything needed for a farm. The few outbuildings had reinforced concrete foundations that went far deeper than their size warranted. And the silence. In a war zone, you become accustomed to certain sounds: the distant crump of artillery, the whine of aircraft, the movement of troops. This place had none of that. It was an acoustic void, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Inside the main administrative building, we found the first physical evidence. In a hastily abandoned office, a filing cabinet had been left unlocked. Most of the contents were mundane supply requisitions for glassware, chemicals, and surgical tools, but buried among them were a few sheets of paper that didn't belong. They were schematic diagrams, but not for any machine we recognized. They showed intricate patterns of concentric circles and angular, rune-like symbols, labeled with code names like Vril 7 and Leyline Conduit. One diagram depicted a humanoid form connected by lines of energy to these geometric patterns. It was annotated in a tight, precise script that one of our men, who had studied some German, translated roughly. Phase 3, corporeal anchoring of the sentient vacuum. The words were scientific, but the concept was pure occultism. This was the Black Sun Project. They weren't building a weapon, they were trying to build a vessel. The most chilling piece of intelligence wasn't a document, but an absence. As we moved through the upper levels, we found living quarters, a mess hall, even a small medical bay. Everything was in perfect order, as if the occupants had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of their duties. Plates with stale food sat on tables. Cigarettes were half-smoked in ashtrays. There were no signs of a struggle, no panic, no hurried evacuation. It was as if the entire staff had vanished into thin air. The only thing out of place was the thick layer of dust that had settled over everything, a dust that seemed too cold for a spring day. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. We were not investigating an abandoned facility. We were walking into a tomb that had been sealed from the inside, for a reason everyone who had been here already understood. The facility we had breached near Brno was just the surface entrance, an administrative shell. The real laboratory, the heart of Project Black Sun, lay hundreds of kilometers to the south, buried deep within the Austrian Alps. This was the final piece of the puzzle we only understood after correlating all the documents. While the Red Army focused on Berlin, the most sensitive SS projects were being relocated to a network of fortified Alpine redoubts, a last-stand fantasy Hitler called the Alpenfestung, or Alpine Fortress. Our discovery was one spoke of that wheel. The Alpine location wasn't chosen for secrecy alone. The Ahnenerbe's ideology was deeply tied to mountains. They believed the great peaks of the world, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Alps, were reservoirs of ancient Earth energy, places where the veil between worlds was thin. The specific site was a repurposed mine complex near the town of Altusee, a place already famous for its salt mines where the Nazis had hidden stolen art treasures. It was the perfect cover. Who would question trucks going in and out of a mine used as a storage depot? But deep beneath the art repository, access through a disguised elevator shaft behind a false rock wall, was a different kind of vault. The environment itself became a character in the horror. The air in the upper mines was cool and dry, preserving the stolen Rembrandts and Michelangelos. But as we descended to the lower levels, the air changed. It grew cold, a damp, penetrating cold that our standard-issue coats couldn't keep out. The electric lights, powered by a hidden generator, cast long, jumping shadows on the rough-hewn rock walls. The only sound was the drip of water and the hum of machinery from deep below. It was a tomb-like silence, but a tomb that was still electrically active, still breathing. This geographical shift from the flatlands of Brandenburg to the heart of the Alps explained the clinical silence we encountered at the Brno entrance. That facility had been a transit point, a sterilized airlock. The real work, the dangerous work, had been moved to this geological fortress. The Alps provided a natural insulation, not just from bombs but from prying eyes and, the occultists likely believed, a stable platform for their attempts to tap into what they called telluric currents. They had chosen this location not for tactical defense, but for mystical reasons, believing the mountain itself would amplify their rituals. We weren't just entering a lab, we were descending into a temple built inside the bones of the earth, a place where the Nazis hoped their dying empire could be reborn as something altogether different and far more terrible. The silence of the place was the silence of concentrated expectation, a held breath waiting for a result that, by the time we arrived, had already occurred. Our unit wasn't the first to reach the heart of the Alpine facility. That grim honor fell to a specialized team we only knew by their call sign, Spectre. They weren't Red Army. They were OSS, the American Office of Strategic Services, sent in under a joint intelligence agreement to secure Nazi scientific assets before the Soviets could. We found their radio logs later. Their mission parameters were simple: locate, document, and extract any material related to advanced psychological warfare and human endurance studies. They had no idea what they were actually walking into. The team was small, just 5 men, led by a Captain John Richter, a veteran of the Italian campaign. Their after-action reports, what little survived, described a standard insertion. They'd located the hidden elevator shaft behind the false rock wall in the Altasee mine and descended into the lower levels. Their first transmissions back to command were professional, clinical. They reported a state-of-the-art laboratory, eerily clean and completely deserted. They noted the strange division of the space. One side a sterile medical bay with operating theaters and refrigeration units, the other a stark, circular chamber whose walls were covered in etched metallic panels, inscribed with intricate patterns that looked like a fusion of electrical schematics and ancient cuneiform. The last clear transmission from Captain Richter is timestamped 04:17 hours. His voice was still calm, but there was a new tension in it, a slight strain. He reported moving into the central chamber. He described a single object in the room's center, a large, transparent cylinder like a massive test tube, connected to the wall panels by thick, insulated cables. The cylinder, he said, was filled with a dense, opaque mist that seemed to swirl slowly under its own power. He noted the temperature had dropped significantly. His final words were, proceeding to investigate the primary asset. Stand by. The next transmission, 90 seconds later, wasn't from Richter. It was from his second-in-command, a Lieutenant Miller. His voice was a ragged whisper, choked with a fear that doesn't come from gunfire or artillery. He wasn't speaking in clear text. He was just repeating 2 words into the mic, over and over. It's breathing. It's breathing. Then the signal dissolved into pure static. When it cleared a minute later, the only sound was a low, rhythmic hum that matched the description of the machinery and a faint, wet, scraping sound. Then silence. The OSS lost all contact. The Spectre team vanished without a single shot being fired. Their last known location was the central chamber. That was the silence we were moving toward. The silence that had greeted the OSS team was gone by the time our unit, reinforced with combat engineers, reached the lower levels. The air was different. The hum of machinery was louder now, a deep, resonant vibration you felt in your teeth more than heard. The sterile corridors of the upper lab gave way to more primitive space, the rock walls of the original mine shored up with steel beams and concrete. The lighting was more sporadic, casting long, dancing shadows. This was no longer a research facility. It felt like the entrance to a fortress. The first trap wasn't a mine or a tripwire. It was psychological. As we approached a heavy steel door marked with a black sun symbol, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of 10 feet. Our breath fogged in the beam of our flashlights. From the other side of the door came a sound, a low, mournful whispering that seemed to have no single source. It was the sound of many voices speaking at once, but the words were indistinct, a susurrus of despair. Several men froze, their hands shaking too badly to hold their weapons. Lieutenant Volkov, a man who had faced down panzer divisions without flinching, went pale. He later said it felt like his own memories of fallen comrades were being pulled out and given voice. It was a sonic barrier, designed to break the will before a single shot was fired. We pushed through, the whispers fading as we breached the door, but the cold remained. Beyond the door, the resistance became physical. The corridor narrowed into a choke point, and that's where the automated defenses activated. Not machine guns, but something worse. Emitters mounted high on the walls discharged not bullets, but pulses of concentrated infrasound, frequencies below the range of human hearing. You couldn't hear it, but you felt it in your bones. A deep, nauseating pressure built in your skull. 2 men at the front vomited and collapsed, clutching their heads. Their noses began to bleed. The engineers identified the source and used shaped charges to blast the emitters from the walls. The pressure lifted instantly, but the damage was done. We were no longer just soldiers on a mission. We were lab rats in a maze designed by madmen. The final barrier before the central chamber was the most bizarre. The corridor opened into a small antechamber. In the center of the room stood a single SS officer. He was perfectly still, dressed in a black uniform that was immaculate without a speck of dust. His eyes were open, but they were completely white, devoid of iris or pupil. He held no weapon. As we entered, he didn't move, but his head slowly tilted to face us. His mouth opened, and a voice emerged, but it wasn't his. It was a flat, synthesized monotone speaking in heavily accented Russian. "Turn back," it said. "The vessel is occupied. The Guardians are awake." One of our men, spooked, raised his rifle. Lieutenant Volkov knocked the barrel down. "Don't," he said. "It's not a man, it's a recording. A warning." We moved past the motionless figure who continued to repeat the phrase, his blank eyes staring at nothing. He was a puppet, a final, chilling piece of theater left by the fleeing scientists. We had breached all the defenses. Only the source of the silence remained. The first chambers beyond the antechamber were a calculated deception. This was the public face of the facility, designed to fool any unauthorized personnel or a cursory military inspection. The walls were lined with charts detailing mundane hematological research and metabolic studies. Stainless steel tables held microscopes and centrifuges. It looked like a standard, if well-funded, military medical lab. Filing cabinets were filled with paperwork on nutrition, sleep deprivation, and combat stress. The deception was meticulous. If you were a Nazi bureaucrat or a general on a tour, this is all you would ever see. It was the perfect cover for what lay deeper. But the cracks in the facade were there, if you knew where to look. The dates on the research logs stopped abruptly in late 1944. The specimens in the refrigeration units weren't blood samples. They were organic matter of an unidentifiable type, preserved in a viscous, faintly phosphorescent fluid. More tellingly, the electrical conduits running along the ceiling didn't power the lab equipment. They were far too thick, humming with a load that the simple lights and microscopes could never require. These massive cables snaked along the walls, disappearing through sealed portals that led deeper into the mountain. The outer lab was a stage set, a shell meant to contain curiosity and send prying eyes down the wrong path. True purpose of these outer layers was logistical and psychological. This was the staging area for the materials needed for the core project. We found empty crates stenciled with codes for rare earth metals and crystalline powders not used in any medical research we knew of. More disturbingly, there was a small barracks area with 12 bunks. Personal effects, letters, photographs, a well-thumbed copy of Nietzsche were still there. These were the support staff, the technicians and guards, but there were no bodies. Their disappearance mirrored the silence of the burn-off facility. They hadn't evacuated. They had been absorbed into the silence of the inner sanctum, consumed by the very project they served. The outer layers weren't just a deception. They were a buffer zone, and everyone stationed within it had ultimately become part of the experiment's fuel. The sterile, orderly front was the last vestige of rational science, a memory that ended at the final airlock door. The airlock door separating the outer lab from the sublevel wasn't marked with warnings. It was seamless, a circular hatch of brushed steel set into the rock wall, indistinguishable from the surrounding stone until you were right upon it. There was no handle, no visible mechanism. Our engineers found the release, a hidden pressure plate disguised as a rock formation. When activated, the door didn't swing open. It retracted inward with a deep hydraulic sigh, revealing not a corridor but a vertical shaft. A dull, reddish glow emanated from somewhere far below, and a wave of air, cold and carrying a scent like ozone and damp earth, washed over us. This was the threshold. Everything up to this point had been antechamber. The real facility began here. A metal ladder, bolted directly into the bare rock, descended into the gloom. Lieutenant Volkov went first, his PPSH-41 slung over his shoulder. I followed. The descent felt endless. The reddish light from below didn't illuminate the shaft. It just colored the darkness, making the rock walls look like old blood. The only sounds were the metallic clang of our boots on the rungs and the low, resonant hum that grew louder with every meter we dropped. It was a sound you felt in your sternum, a vibration that spoke of immense power being channeled deep within the earth. After what felt like 5 minutes of climbing down, we reached a small landing. The ladder continued further, but a tunnel branched off horizontally here. The air was noticeably thinner, and the cold was intense, a dry, penetrating chill that our uniforms were useless against. The tunnel was narrow, forcing us to move in single file. The walls were no longer mined rock. They were lined with smooth, black ceramic tiles that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. Etched into the tiles were the same angular, runic patterns we had seen in the schematics upstairs, but these were filled with a faint, phosphorescent material that gave off a sickly green light. They pulsed in time with the hum, a slow, rhythmic heartbeat of light and sound. The tunnel curved gently, and as we rounded the bend, we saw the source of the red glow. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. We were on a narrow gantry, a metal walkway suspended over a deep pit. Below, in the center of the pit, was the source of the light and the sound. It was the cylinder Captain Richter had described, but his description failed to capture its scale. It was massive, at least 4 meters tall and 2 wide, made of a thick, transparent material. Inside, the opaque mist swirled violently, lit from within by the deep crimson glow. Thick bundles of the same heavy cables we'd seen upstairs snaked across the floor of the pit, connecting the cylinder to banks of strange machinery that lined the walls, arrays of glass tubes that flickered with internal lightning and spinning copper wheels. But the cylinder wasn't the only thing in the pit. Scattered around its base, lying in poses of sudden collapse, were the remains of the laboratory's staff. They weren't decomposed. They were desiccated, as if all moisture had been instantly sucked from their bodies. Their faces were frozen in identical expressions of silent, open-mouthed horror. They hadn't been killed. They had been emptied. And in the center of the chamber, standing perfectly still and facing away from us, was the lone figure of an SS officer, his black uniform stark against the hellish red light. He was looking up at the cylinder. He was waiting. The officer standing before the cylinder was Obersturmbannführer Klaus von Yeager, the scientific director of Project Black Sun. We only learned his name later from the dog tags on his desiccated body. He didn't turn as we cautiously moved onto the gantry. His attention was completely fixed on the swirling mist. The chamber itself was a perfect circle, and the walls were not just ceramic. They were inlaid with a mosaic of metallic symbols that formed a massive, complex pattern, a larger version of the Black Sun emblem. The air hummed with the low-frequency drone, but now there was another sound layered underneath it, a rhythmic, wet, clicking noise, like two slick stones being knocked together. It was coming from inside the cylinder. Scattered across the floor, amidst the grotesque remains of the staff, were the tools of the ritual. It wasn't a laboratory setup. There were surgical trays, yes, but next to them were bowls carved from what looked like human bone, filled with a dark, congealed substance. Thick candles made of a strange, waxy material had been placed at precise points around the cylinder's base, their flames burning with an unnatural, cold blue light that cast no heat. The symbols on the floor weren't painted. They were channels, grooves cut into the stone and filled with a silvery, mercury-like liquid that pulsed in time with the hum. This was the culmination. The clean science of the outer lab had been a lie. This was the truth, a desperate, barbaric ceremony. The sacrifices were evident. The desiccated bodies weren't just technicians who had been caught in an accident. They were arranged, their limbs positioned to form points of a star pattern radiating from the cylinder. Their mouths were open in that silent scream because they had been part of the ritual's final act, their life force used as a battery to power whatever was happening inside that tank. This was the corporeal anchoring the files had mentioned. They weren't trying to create life from nothing. They were trying to force a non-human consciousness into our reality, using human energy as the bridge. The silence of the upper levels, the vanished staff, it all made a horrific sense. They hadn't fled. They had been consumed as fuel for this last, monstrous prayer. Von Yeager standing there was the high priest waiting for his god to answer. And as we watched, the clicking from the cylinder stopped. The swirling mist inside began to coalesce, to solidify into a vague, humanoid shape. The ritual was complete. The vessel was occupied. The equipment surrounding the central cylinder was a nightmare fusion of the modern and the archaic. It was a laboratory, but one dedicated to a science that had no basis in any rational world. The Tesla coils Captain Richter had noted were the most prominent feature, towering, brass-wound structures that crackled with silent arcs of blue-white electricity, their energy feeding directly into the base of the transparent tank. But interspersed among these marvels of engineering were objects of pure superstition. On a stone altar to the side of the chamber lay a collection of ritual daggers, their blades etched with the same runes that covered the walls. Their hilts were wrapped in a dark, stained leather I didn't want to identify. Glass-fronted cabinets held not scientific instruments, but rows of crystals, each positioned at a specific angle to catch and refract the hellish red light from the cylinder. Wires, insulated with a strange, fibrous material, ran from these crystals to the main machinery, as if the Nazis were attempting to channel some imagined mystical energy through a physical circuit. The air smelled of ozone from the electrical discharge, but underneath it was the cloying scent of incense and something else, something metallic and old, like dried blood. This was the heart of Himmler's obsession, the belief that the cold logic of the machine could be married to the raw power of the occult. They had built a cathedral to this insane idea, and the central cylinder was its blasphemous altar. The setup was designed for a single, horrific purpose: transference. The files we later reconstructed suggested the process had multiple phases. The first involved the biological preparation of a host body, likely performed in the sterile outer labs. The second, conducted here, was the metaphysical phase. The Tesla coils and electrical apparatus were not just for power. They were meant to create a field of immense energy, a forced opening or a tear in reality. The ritual tools, the crystals, the sacrificial channels in the floor, these were the focusing agents, the lens through which this man-made lightning was meant to project a consciousness from elsewhere into the waiting vessel. The clicking sound had ceased because the process was complete. The swirling crimson mist inside the cylinder was no longer formless. It had drawn in on itself, condensing into a shape that was vaguely humanoid but profoundly wrong. It had the outline of a tall, slender man, but its proportions were off, the limbs too long, the head slightly too large and devoid of any discernible features. It wasn't a solid form. It was a silhouette of concentrated darkness, a hole in the light of the tank, an absence given a temporary shape. It stood motionless, and the deep hum of the machinery seemed to change, lowering in pitch, becoming a contented, predatory purr. Obersturmbannführer von Yeager finally moved. He took a step closer to the cylinder, his arms outstretched in a gesture of supplication. He was welcoming his creation. He was greeting the thing that was not human. The subject files were not in the central chamber. They were in a smaller, secondary office, a windowless room sealed behind another of those heavy steel doors. It was untouched, preserved in the moment the staff had abandoned it. And it was here, in the cold, silent glow of a single emergency light, that we found the true horror of Project Black Sun. It wasn't the monster they created. It was the meticulous, clinical process of its creation. The files were bound in black leather, each one designated for a different phase of the operation. Phase Alpha was acquisition. It wasn't about gathering materials. It was about selecting human subjects. The criteria were specific: male between 18 and 25, Aryan phenotype, and this was the key notation: psychically receptive. They weren't just looking for strong bodies. They were screening for a specific mental wavelength, a susceptibility they believed would make a consciousness transfer easier. The files contained photographs of young men, mostly political prisoners and concentration camp inmates, their eyes blank with fear or defiance. Each photo was stamped with a date and a single word: processed. Phase Beta was preparation. This was the work of the sterile outer lab. Medical reports detailed a brutal regimen of sensory deprivation, extreme temperature exposure, and a cocktail of experimental drugs derived from mescaline and scopolamine. The goal, stated in the dry, scientific language of the reports, was to dissolve the host's egoic structure and create a neutral vessel. They were systematically erasing the person who was already there, scrubbing the canvas clean for a new painting. The final entry for each subject was always the same. Subject is prepared, cortical activity minimal, proceeding to final phase. The final files, phase Gamma, were the thinnest but the most disturbing. They contained no photographs, only diagrams of the central chamber and the runic arrays. There were logs of energy readings, timings based on astrological charts, and descriptions of the ritual incantations used. But the human cost was reduced to a single, cold metric. Each attempt to bind the entity to a prepared body was logged with a power consumption figure, measured in units they called fuel. The logs showed a series of failures, each one requiring a higher energy input, a higher fuel rating than the last. We realized with a sinking dread what that metric truly measured. It wasn't electricity. It was the life force, the psychic energy of the sacrifice support staff we had found desiccated around the cylinder. They were the fuel. The final, successful entry was timestamped just hours before the OSS team arrived. The fuel reading was off the scale. The note beside it, in von Yeager's precise hand, read simply, "Der Anchor hält, der Wächter ist erwacht." The anchor holds. The guardian is awake. They had finally paid enough. The files told the story of the human cost, but the physical evidence of what they were trying to achieve lay in a refrigerated annex off the main chamber. It was a place the OSS team never reached. The door was a massive, vault-like seal, and when our engineers managed to crack it, a wave of frigid, chemically scented air poured out. Inside was a long, low room, its walls lined with storage units that looked like oversized filing cabinets made of stainless steel. Each drawer was labeled not with a name, but with a code and a date. The air hummed with the sound of powerful refrigeration compressors, a sound so constant it had become part of the background silence. We pulled open the first drawer. It slid out smoothly on well-oiled rails. Inside, resting on a stainless steel tray, was a biological specimen submerged in a clear, viscous fluid. It was not human. It was a limb, but the proportions were all wrong. The bone structure was elongated, the joints articulated in a way that suggested a different kind of movement. The skin, pale and almost translucent, showed a network of dark, purplish veins that pulsed with a faint, residual luminescence, as if some energy still flickered within it. It wasn't decay, it was a form of life suspended and studied. The label on the tray read Versuch 7A Primia Structure, Trial 7A Primary Structure. This was a component, a spare part. Further drawers revealed more. Some contained organs that had no analogs in any biology we knew, pulsating sacs of tissue, crystalline nodules grown around nerve clusters, what looked like a heart but with 6 chambers instead of 4. Each was a masterpiece of biological engineering, grown in a vat, perfectly preserved. They were attempts to construct a vessel from scratch, building a body that could house a consciousness that had never been born of this world. The failures were there too, in drawers marked with red tags. Twisted, malformed masses of tissue, things that had started to grow but had collapsed under their own unnatural design. One looked like a human torso that had been stretched and folded back onto itself, its single, central eye staring blindly up from the preserving fluid. The most disturbing section was at the far end of the room. Here, the cabinets were larger, and the contents were not just parts but complete integrated forms. These were the failed vessels from Phase Gamma. They were human in basic shape, but the modifications were horrifying. One had its ribcage fused into a solid, bony carapace. Another had skin that was a patchwork of scales and smooth flesh. Their faces were the worst, frozen in expressions of silent agony, their features subtly distorted, as if the very essence of their humanity had been stretched and warped by the force trying to inhabit them. They weren't just dead. They were ruined templates, proof that the human form was not a compatible host for what the Nazis were trying to summon. This cold storage room was a library of their arrogance, a collection of biological heresies that proved they could build the body, but they could never make it fit the guest. The final, successful vessel waited in the central chamber, and it was clear now that its success was not because they had perfected the design, but because they had stopped trying to use a human base at all. The thing in the cylinder was something else entirely. The thing in the cylinder wasn't a monster in any conventional sense. It was an impossibility. The humanoid silhouette we saw from the gantry wasn't a solid form. It was a silhouette of absolute blackness, a void that absorbed the crimson light from the tank, creating a shape defined only by the absence of anything else. It had no features, no texture, no discernible substance. It was a hole in reality, a cutout, and it was becoming more defined. As we watched, the edges of the silhouette sharpened, as if whatever was on the other side of that hole was pressing closer, forcing its outline onto our world. The deep hum of the machinery had shifted. It was no longer a steady drone. It was a rhythmic pulse, a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to synchronize with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration coming from the cylinder itself. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the atmosphere was congealing around us. Obersturmbannführer von Jäger stood before this impossibility, his back still to us. He raised his hands, palms facing the cylinder, and began to speak. His voice was calm, reverent, a low chant in German. He wasn't speaking to us. He was speaking to the void. Der Schleier ist dünn, der Pfad ist geöffnet, komm zu uns, Wächter, nimm deine Gestalten. The veil is thin. The path is open. Come to us, guardian, take your form. As he chanted, the silhouette in the cylinder seemed to ripple. The absolute blackness within its outline swirled for a moment, and then something changed. It wasn't a movement. It was a shift in perception. We weren't looking at a silhouette anymore. We were looking into a depth, a tunnel that stretched away into an infinite, starless night. The containment wasn't holding a creature. It was holding open a doorway. Lieutenant Volkov signaled for us to hold our positions. Our mission was to secure the facility, but this was beyond any protocol. The clicking sound started again, but now we could pinpoint its source. It wasn't coming from inside the cylinder. It was the sound of the cylinder's material itself, the thick, transparent polymer, groaning under a stress that wasn't physical. Fine, hairline cracks began to web across its surface, glowing with the same crimson light. The Tesla coils crackled with increased intensity, pouring more energy into the base of the tank, trying to reinforce the field. They weren't powering the entity. They were fighting it. They were trying to keep the door from swinging fully open. The project hadn't contained a being. It had successfully pierced the veil between dimensions, and now the entire apparatus was struggling to maintain a stable puncture, a controlled leak. What we were witnessing was the failure of that control. The Guardian wasn't being summoned. It was breaking through. Von Yeager seemed oblivious to the impending structural failure. His chant grew louder, more fervent. He was a scientist who had crossed into fanaticism, a high priest witnessing the arrival of his god. He took another step forward, his hand outstretched as if to touch the cylinder. That's when the first major crack appeared with a sound like a rifle shot. A shard of the transparent material fell inward, but it didn't hit the floor of the tank. It vanished into the blackness, swallowed by the infinite depth. The hum of the machinery became a strained whine. The crimson light from inside flickered violently. The void was no longer holding a shape. It began to expand, bleeding out beyond the confines of the silhouette, seeping into the chamber like a spill of pure nothingness. The air turned bitingly cold. The containment was failing. We weren't looking at what they had contained. We were seeing the beginning of its release. The doorway was breaking, and whatever was on the other side was starting to come through. Lieutenant Volkov's order to hold position died in the air, replaced by a new sound that wasn't a sound at all. It was a pressure drop, a sudden silence within the silence that made our ears pop. The strained whine of the Tesla coils cut out. The crimson light from the cylinder didn't just flicker, it died, plunging the chamber into near-total blackness for a heart-stopping second. Then, the emergency lighting high on the cavern walls snapped on, casting a sickly, dim yellow glow. In that sudden shift, the nature of the thing in the chamber changed completely. The cylinder was no longer a container. It was a shattered ruin. The transparent walls had collapsed inward, but the blackness didn't dissipate. It clung to the broken frame like a viscous shadow, a stain on reality, and it was moving. It wasn't an expansion, not a flood. It was an unfolding. The humanoid silhouette lost its shape, dissolving into a cloud of absolute black that hovered in the center of the wreckage. It had no surface, no texture. Looking at it was like looking into a patch of night that had fallen to the earth and refused to be lit. It absorbed the weak yellow light, creating a hole in the visual field that hurt the eyes to focus on. Obersturmbannführer von Yeager finally turned. He wasn't looking at us. His face was ecstatic, tears streaming down his cheeks, but his eyes were wide with a terror that his smile couldn't conceal. He took a step toward the swirling darkness, his arms still outstretched. "Mein Wächter," he whispered, "my guardian." The cloud of blackness pulsed. It didn't move toward him. A tendril, a filament of pure shadow extended from its mass. It didn't travel through the air. It simply connected the cloud to von Yeager's forehead in an instant, as if the space between them didn't exist. There was no scream. Von Yeager's body went rigid. His ecstatic expression froze, then slackened into utter blankness. The color drained from his face, not to pale white, but to a dull, ashen gray. He didn't collapse. He stood there, a statue, for 3 full seconds. Then the connection severed. The tendril of shadow retracted back into the main cloud, and Klaus von Yeager dissolved. It wasn't a violent explosion. It was a quiet, horrifying deconstruction. His body lost its cohesion, crumbling into a fine gray dust that settled onto the stone floor with a soft hiss. His uniform collapsed into an empty heap. There was nothing left. He hadn't been killed. He had been unmade, his entire physical existence converted into inert powder. The cloud pulsed again, seeming larger now. It began to drift, not with purpose, but with a slow, languid motion like smoke seeking a draft. It floated toward the nearest of the desiccated corpses on the floor. As it passed over the shriveled body, the corpse didn't just turn to dust like von Yeager. It inverted. The dry skin and bones seemed to be pulled inward, sucked into a single point and then vanishing, leaving behind not even a stain. The entity was consuming the residual energy, the last echoes of the life that had been sacrificed to create it. It was cleaning its plate, and then it stopped its drift. It hung in the air, motionless. The low hum which had ceased with the machinery returned, but now it was emanating from the cloud itself. It was a sound of waiting. It had dealt with the architect. Now it was aware of the witnesses. The cloud slowly rotated. It had no eyes, no face, but we felt its attention shift. It was now facing us on the gantry. The moment of discovery was over. The confrontation had begun. What happened next wasn't a firefight. You cannot shoot a shadow. The cloud of absolute blackness hung in the air, its attention fixed on our position on the gantry. The hum emanating from it wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a vibration that resonated in the marrow of your bones, a frequency that spoke of a cold, alien intelligence assessing its new environment. Lieutenant Volkov gave the only order that made any sense. Fall back. Now. We didn't run. We moved backward in a controlled retreat, our weapons trained on the entity, though we all knew the utter futility of it. The thing didn't pursue. It simply watched, if watching is what you call that feeling of being stripped bare, of having your very existence noted and filed away by something that operated on a level we couldn't comprehend. It was studying the disruption we represented. We reached the antechamber with the motionless SS officer. He was still there, still repeating his monotone warning. The vessel is occupied. The Guardians are awake. The words held a new, terrifying weight. We sealed the heavy steel door behind us, not because we thought it would hold the entity, but because the act of closing a door was a human gesture, a desperate attempt to reimpose order on a situation that had shattered all known rules. Our radio, which had been silent since we entered the sublevel, crackled to life. Command was demanding a status report. Volkov's transmission was brief, his voice stripped of all emotion. Facility is not secure. Hostile non-biological entity is active. All OSS personnel are confirmed KIA, requesting immediate backup and specialist containment team, highest priority classification. The response was immediate and chilling in its own way. Acknowledged, Spectre 2. Stand by. A special detachment is en route. Do not, repeat, do not engage the anomaly. Your new priority is to quarantine the area until arrival. The special detachment arrived within 2 hours. They weren't regular army. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency that was unnerving. They wore unmarked black uniforms, and their equipment was unlike anything we'd seen. Sensors that glowed with a soft blue light, containment fields housed in heavy briefcases. They didn't speak to us beyond issuing terse commands to vacate the lower levels. They cordoned off the entire mountain, from the Altasea mine entrance down. We were debriefed not by our commanding officers, but by a man in a civilian suit who identified himself only as Herr Schmidt from the Ministry for State Security. The debriefing was less an interview and more a process of confiscation. Our personal logs, any sketches we'd made, even the rolls of film from the unit's camera were seized. We were made to sign documents under the Official Secrets Act, documents that threatened prosecution under charges of treason for discussing anything we had seen. The official report that was filed, the one that exists in the declassified archives, bears no resemblance to what happened. It states that the facility was a standard chemical weapons research lab, abandoned by the retreating Germans. It claims the OSS team and the lab staff were killed by booby traps and a leaking nerve agent. Our unit was credited with securing the site and neutralizing the hazard. There is no mention of a central chamber, no Tesla coils, no void entity. Obersturmbannführer Klaus von Yeager is listed as having escaped. The truth was surgically removed from history. The mountain was sealed. The tunnels collapsed by controlled demolition a week later. We were reassigned to different units, scattered across the front to ensure our story couldn't be corroborated. The silence we had encountered in the lab was nothing compared to the silence that fell afterwards, the state-mandated, absolute quiet that buried the truth of Project Black Sun, and the thing they woke up deep under the Austrian Alps. We had not contained it. We had merely been the first to witness its freedom, and our reward was to be erased from the story ourselves. The official story was a clean, surgical lie. The mountain was sealed, our reports were confiscated, and we were scattered to different fronts. But the silence that followed wasn't just about hiding a failed Nazi experiment. It was about salvaging it. What we didn't know, as we were being debriefed by the man from the Ministry for State Security, was that a parallel operation was already underway. While our unit was being sworn to secrecy, a different kind of team was arriving at the Altasea facility. Not soldiers, but American scientific intelligence officers operating under a new, top-secret directive. This was Operation Paperclip, and Project Black Sun was its most prized, most terrifying catch. The entity we had encountered was not destroyed. The specialist detachment that relieved us wasn't there for containment in the sense of elimination. Their mission, as we would piece together decades later from declassified fragments, was assessment and acquisition. They found the central chamber exactly as we had left it. The shattered cylinder, the dust that was once von Yeager, the empty spaces where the desiccated bodies had been inverted out of existence. And they found the entity. It had not left. It had settled. The cloud of blackness had retreated to the center of the ruined apparatus, coiling in on itself like a resting predator. Their sensors, designed to measure radiation and energy signatures, registered nothing. It was a perfect void in every spectrum, but their psychometric equipment, a new and highly classified technology, went haywire. It registered a consciousness, but one so alien, so vast and cold, that the readings were off the scale. The paperclip scientists didn't see a monster. They saw the ultimate intelligence asset, a weapon that could not be countered by any known means. The cover-up then expanded beyond the Soviets. A quiet agreement was reached in the shadow of the Potsdam Conference. The official Allied and Soviet records were both scrubbed clean, each blaming the other for the destruction of the facility. The truth was, a joint, clandestine custodianship was established. The mountain remained sealed, but it was not abandoned. It became a black site, jointly monitored by agencies that didn't officially exist. The work of von Yeager and his team was not dismissed as occult nonsense. It was studied, reverse-engineered. The biological specimens we found in the cold storage were secretly transported to facilities in the United States. The ritual incantations, the runic arrays, these were analyzed not as magic, but as a form of resonant technology, a way of manipulating reality on a fundamental level. The silence we were forced into was the foundation of a new, hidden arms race, one based not on atomic fission, but on metaphysical conquest. The Guardians were indeed awake, and the powers of the world had decided to try and put them on a leash. That decision in the summer of 1945 cast a long shadow over the rest of the century and into our own. The Cold War wasn't just a conflict of ideologies. It was a cover for a much deeper, quieter war. The entities, the patterns, the technologies recovered from sites like the one in Altasea became the foundation for projects that remain classified to this day. The psychic arms race, the experiments in remote viewing, the stories of strange creatures encountered in the dark forests of East Germany, they all trace a line back to that chamber, to the moment the veil was torn. I am the last surviving member of my unit. The others didn't die in combat. They died in car accidents, from sudden, unexplained illnesses, in suicides that made no sense to their families. The silence was enforced, and it was permanent. I have lived my life knowing that the official history of the world is a carefully constructed fiction. The real history, the one that matters, is written in the gaps, in the stories that are too strange to be believed. The Nazi occult lab wasn't an anomaly. It was a glimpse of the true battlefield, a place where human ambition reached into the dark and pulled something back. We didn't defeat it. We just learned to live in the same world as it, pretending it wasn't there. But sometimes, in the deep silence of the night, I can still feel that cold hum, the vibration of a door that was opened and can never be fully closed. The legacy of the lab is the knowledge that we are not alone, and that some of our neighbors are not and never were human. If you want to understand the real secrets of the last century, look not to the bomb, but to the silence that followed. Subscribe for more stories they tried to bury.